This is the story of a 3-month voyage in a wooden rowboat through the Inside Passage from Skagway, Alaska to Sidney, British Columbia, about 1,250 miles or 2,000 kilometers. This episode is part 3 and describes the last stage of the trip from Port McNeill to Sidney. Preceding episodes include the prologue, part 1 and part 2. The prologue explains the route through the Inside Passage, the boat and gear, and getting to Bellingham, Washington to catch the Alaska State Ferry to Skagway. Part 1 describes the first stage from Skagway to Prince Rupert, through the Alexander Archipelago, and along the mainland of southeast Alaska. Part 2 describes the second stage through the Great Bear Rainforest from Prince Rupert to Port McNeill. Part 3 follows the southern coast of British Columbia through the Broughton Archipelago, Discovery Islands, the western part of Desolation Sound, across the Strait of Georgia, and finally through the Gulf Islands to the town of Sidney, near the southern tip of Vancouver Island. This coast is dominated by strong tidal currents that flood and ebb the many inlets, sounds, and straits. On this part of the North American coast, the tides are semi-diurnal, meaning there are 2 tides per day of unequal height. The interval between successive high waters is about half a day. The tide travels north along the coast of Washington State and enters Juan de Fuca Strait to flood the Salish Sea, Puget Sound, and the Strait of Georgia. The tide also progresses north along the west coast of Vancouver Island and then floods Queen Charlotte Strait and continues south into Johnston Strait and then through multiple channels in the Discovery Islands to meet the tide that came north from Juan de Fuca Strait in the vicinity of Cape Mudge and Desolation Sound. The tidal currents between Vancouver Island and the mainland are the fastest on Earth, and at Seymour Narrows, the tidal rapids can have velocities of 15 knots, or 28 kilometers per hour. The route Waterbird followed through these channels has 6 relatively severe tidal rapids. The first was at Chatham Channel, that has a maximum current velocity of 8 knots, then Whirlpool Rapids with a velocity of 6 knots, Green Point Rapids with a current reaching 7 knots, followed by the rapids at Dent Island, 11 knots, Gillard Passage, 13 knots, and Yucatán Rapids with a maximum current over 10 knots. At dawn on July 18th, Waterbird departed from the Port McNeill boat harbor and entered Broughton Strait. I had to stop for about 30 minutes to let the BC ferry servicing Malcolm Island go by, and then got trapped for almost 3 hours in the Plumper Islands where an unexpected current, more like a water jet, couldn't be rowed against. I finally managed to escape when the current subsided by rowing very hard, gaining only a few feet with every stroke, and ended up in Blackfish Sound just when the Alaska ferry Kennecott appeared from around a corner. Within 30 minutes I was very concerned about getting run over, until I saw the captain on the flybridge waving at me. Maybe it was the same captain that delivered me to Skagway 2 months before. It was late in the day when I finally arrived at the campsite on Leone Island, and had to share the anchorage with a sailing yacht from Vancouver. It didn't matter, I was exhausted and fell into a deep sleep. On July 19th, I packed up early and used the calm, drizzly weather and flooding tide to row through the islands of the Broughton Archipelago, crossing Indian Channel, Village Channel, and Elliott Passage to reach Canoe Passage that separates Turnure Island from Village Island and eventually leads to Knight Inlet. Extremely high tides and the general lack of dry level ground forced me to seek unusual campsites that were likely refuge rocks for early Native Americans. The first was on Lady Island in Knight Inlet that had a well-established canoe run. I stayed on the island for 2 days while the winds continued raging in Johnston Strait.
Johnston Strait, gale warning in effect. Wind northwest 15 to 25 knots, increasing to northwest 30 to 35 early this evening, then diminishing to northwest 15 to 25 late overnight. Wind becoming northwest 20 to 30 Monday afternoon.
The next obstacle was Chatham Channel and the rapids near the confluence with Call Inlet. It took most of the morning to reach the channel and row up current for 6 miles or 10 kilometers, but it was slack water at the rapids when I arrived, so managed to avoid that hazard. When I rounded the corner into Havana Channel, the winds were already blowing hard from Johnston Strait, so it was a struggle to reach the Broken Islands where I planned to camp. But the effort was so worthwhile because the camp that night was in a spectacular place. On July 23rd, I planned to row along Johnston Strait and into Sunderland Channel to camp on Points Island near the entrance to Wellbore Channel. This would put Waterbird in a good position to go through Whirlpool Rapids the next day. The tides were now ebbing in the morning and flooding in the afternoon, so there was no need to leave early, except that the winds seemed to invariably increase in the afternoon. I was hoping for some calm weather following the latest gale, but that didn't happen. I had learned that I can row against a current, but strong headwinds were difficult. The best way to continue making progress in these conditions was to row against the current during the calm morning hours and then, only if necessary, fight the headwinds in the afternoon. It was a very long day to Points Island, and when I arrived at the campsite, the landing beach was almost completely blocked by a massive drift log. But the wind was coming up, and I was too tired to keep going, and somehow managed to secure Waterbird for the night despite the log. But during the following extreme high tide in the dark of night, I had to check on Waterbird several times in case the log refloated. Early the next morning, the wind was already blowing hard from Johnston Strait, and it was a struggle to make the entrance to Wellbore Channel and the start of Whirlpool Rapids. The rapids are named for the strong upwelling boils and swirling eddies in the channel that separates Hardwick Island from the mainland. However, the transit through the channel was uneventful, even though Waterbird had to endure considerable jostling from the turbulent swirls. I continued south to Chancellor Channel, where the wind from Johnston Strait was making a difficult choppy sea, but at least it was a downwind run to the campsite at the base of Solitary Mountain. It was a short day, but this spot was perfect for the next day's run through Greenpoint Rapids. The campsite was marked with an official sign, and had a visitor's logbook, the first I had seen on this trip, but with only a few entries. The landing was a bit rough, and there was a lot of boat traffic going by, mostly pleasure boats and at least one log tow, but Waterbird was safe and secure. On July 25th, I waited at the solitary mountain camp for several hours for the ebbing tide to slow down, and left at around 11 a.m. to get to Greenpoint for the slack at 1:30 p.m. There was still a lot of turbulence even though the water velocity was not a problem, and Waterbird got through the rapids without any issues, and I then followed Cordero Channel along the shore of East Thurlow Island, past Bickley Bay and Shoal Bay to Johns Point, where I planned to camp. Near Shoal Bay, an inflatable yacht tender came up behind Waterbird, and I met James and his son who were out fishing for salmon. It was a short exchange, but their curiosity about Waterbird and the trip from Alaska, as well as their sincere generosity, was heartwarming at a time when I felt a bit out of touch with humanity. The camp at Johns Point was relatively well developed, with several picnic tables apparently used by charter boats for a lunch stop. It was another short day and only mid-afternoon when I arrived, but it was so sunny and warm that I washed and did some laundry. The next day I again departed after 11 a.m. and rode against the remains of the ebbing tide to reach Dent Rapids at the slack before the flood. I arrived a bit early and had to wait for about 30 minutes for the water to calm down, and then rode hard to get through the Gallard and Euclita Rapids before the flood current became dangerous. I went through the Gallard Islands and rounded the corner into Big Bay at Sea Lion Point, where two massive stellar sea lion bulls were battling each other, with one showing bloody gashes. They stopped fighting and both eyeballed me, but I didn't want any part of that action, so quickly rode on past the opulent Sonora Resort, where a high-speed fishing boat sent a wave that crashed over the bow of Waterbird. I had to stop and bail water, right in front of the lodge guests sipping champagne on the balcony. The camp that night was on the northern tip of North Rendezvous Island in Calm Channel, and it seemed so peaceful, but maybe that was just my relief, knowing the last of the major tidal rapids was left behind. On July 27th, I continued south in Calm Channel, hugging the eastern shoreline of the Rendezvous Islands to the entrance of Lewis Channel that separates Cortez Island from West Redonda Island. Based on the vessel traffic I saw going through Lewis Channel, it seems to be a major gateway to the Discovery Islands north of the Strait of Georgia, and a popular way to avoid Seymour Narrows and some of Johnston Strait. Once through the channel, the traffic volume went up exponentially, mostly with vessels bound for Desolation Sound. When I crossed the entrance to Squirrel Cove, large power boats were crisscrossing my path, and the wake was annoyingly difficult to row through. I spotted a large skiff in the distance that was heading straight for Waterbird, and they were still closing fast on the stern when I recognized a friend at the helm. They were from a motor yacht anchored 8 miles away in Desolation Sound, and came to deliver beers and fresh fruit. It was so nice to see familiar faces, the first in almost 3 months. We chatted for about 30 minutes while the waves rolled underneath us, and I was very happy to connect with friends under a sunny sky. Then, just as suddenly, they were gone. I continued on to North Copeland Island, the first fully developed campsite since leaving Skagway, Alaska, and arrived in the early afternoon. The only other people there were Keith and Lori, kayakers from Vancouver Island. I was mentally prepared for a crowd since it was a weekend, and by the evening all the campsites were fully occupied. This felt like a huge crowd to me, and while most of them stayed up late into the night, I was asleep by 9 p.m. and rather anxious to leave the next morning. I was packed and ready to leave at 7 a.m., and Keith was the only other person I saw. It would be a very short day rowing through the Copeland Islands to the village of Lund on the Malaspina Peninsula. I arrived at around 9 a.m. in time for a delicious breakfast at Nancy's Bakery. Gale force winds and a lot of rain were forecasted the next day for the northern Strait of Georgia, so I decided to take a rest day and checked into the hotel. On July 30, I left Lund at daybreak, knowing it would be a 16-mile upwind slog into the remains of the gale. What took me by surprise was the fatigue that set in early. My legs felt like lead instead of spring steel. I stopped often, but not for long, since the wind would quickly drive Waterbird backward. It took 4 hours to go 8 miles, and I was soon exhausted from being slammed by waves with every stroke of the oars. As an incentive, I decided to forego the campground at Willingdon Beach that night and get a hotel room in Powell River. The thought of a hot shower kept me going past Savory Island, then across Shearwater Passage where the waves were rolling in from the Strait of Georgia. A huge water release from the hydroelectric dam at Powell River created even more turbulence. Then I passed a breakwater made from anchored ships, and I could finally see the entrance to the town marina. After 7 hours of being pummeled by waves from every possible direction, jounced by tide rips, and sprayed with seawater, I rode into the harbor and laid back in Waterbird, totally spent. I was unloading Waterbird at the boat ramp when I heard someone calling my name. I looked up to see Renee, whom I first met almost a month earlier at Oliver Cove north of Bella Bella. He set me up with a place to keep Waterbird safe and me fed. That turned the whole day around from one of the crappiest to one of the best. The headwind subsided a little overnight, and the next morning I rode across Malaspina Strait, dodging the BC ferry traffic that was on the same route to the north end of Texada Island. Rounding Blubber Point, the wind veered to the north, and the row south along the coast of Texada was much easier. I rode past the docks of the Texada Quarry, a large-scale limestone mine, and then stopped at the Shelter Point Park campground, but it was full, so I pressed on and camped on a random tombolo that appeared just when the afternoon wind started increasing. The beach ridge had barely enough room for a tent at high tide, but it was perfect for Waterbird and me. At daybreak on August 1st, it was calm, and I continued south along the Texada Island coast and crossed Sabine Channel that separates Texada Island from Lesquiti Island to the west. There are several islands in Sabine Channel, the largest being Jervis and Jedediah Islands, with Jervis Island being part of Sabine Channel Provincial Park. By late morning, the winds were getting stronger from the north, so my goal was to camp on Jervis Island and wait for a calm weather window forecasted for the next day to make the long crossing of the Strait of Georgia. In the morning it was practically calm, with lots of boat traffic, but otherwise a perfect day for the crossing to Balenes Island. The historic lighthouse was my navigational landmark for the 7-mile crossing of the Strait of Georgia. The lighthouse was built in 1912 and has been automated since 1996. The campsite was on the southern end of the North Island, and surprisingly, once again, I had the place to myself despite the long weekend holiday. I had planned to spend a night on Newcastle Island near Nanaimo, which has a well-known campground with hot showers, but reservations were required weeks in advance, and it was full that weekend. So I rowed all the way to the south end of Gabriola Island under the towering outer coastal cliffs. I camped in a new park on Saturnina Island in Silva Bay. When I arrived, there were 6 boats anchored off the beach that was covered with at least 30 people and 10 dogs, but no one stayed for the night. I later met my friends Fiona and Paul, who paddled out from Gabriola Island with a canoe seemingly full of food and beer. Although the number of people and boats continued increasing, the weather was sunny and dry, and the spectacular Gulf Islands still impressed. On August 4th, I decided to stay on the outer coast and followed the cliffs of Valdez Island south to Porlier Pass. I went by several reefs with small clusters of Steller and California sea lions, and arrived at the eastern entrance to Porlier Pass during the last hour of the ebbing tide. Waterbird was carried through the pass at over 6 knots by the remains of the ebbing current. I then turned south in Trincomalee Channel and rowed along the eastern shore of the Secretary Islands to a campsite on the north end of Wallis Island for the last night of the trip. The campsite was developed with tent platforms, picnic tables, and an outhouse. I was very lucky that one of only 2 waterfront sites had just been vacated an hour before I arrived. Waterbird had a safe place to anchor, and the camp was remarkably peaceful despite being fully occupied. As if that evening couldn't get any better, another rower arrived, and she later brought beers and chips to my campsite, and we watched the sunset. That night I felt an indescribable serenity. The last day of the trip from Wallis Island to Sidney was a beautiful but long 25 miles into a relentless headwind, dodging the predictable increase in weekend boat traffic and the BC ferries converging on Swartz Bay. The day ended with a quiet sigh on a concrete boat ramp at Van Isle Marina.
I've spent too long waiting from it all the things I could have done. Gone off the ways of industries. I know I'm not the only one. So long. Going home. I want the sun to hit my face through old trees in the open light. Forget about the things that you want. Be thankful for what all you got. So long. I'm going home. So long.
And just like that, this fantastic voyage was finished.
Touchdown confirmed. We're safe on line. Curiosity will take us.
The third stage of the trip covered 270 miles or 432 kilometers from Port McNeill to Sidney in 17 days, plus 2 weather days and 1 town day in Lund. The total distance from Skagway to Sidney was 1,250 miles or 2,000 kilometers, rowed in 63 days with 15 weather days, mostly in Alaska, and 5 town days. Thank you for following this journey. Waterbird will soon return with more adventures, so please subscribe or check back on this channel for new episodes.